Today, we are joined by Jonathon Van Maren, and we're going to be discussing some very important things about the history of the sexual revolution and how we can all make a difference in the fight against abortion. Jonathon, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. Some people may not have heard of you before, even though you have written several books and you're doing very important work at the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. So you are well known to many people, but to those who have not gotten to meet you yet or hear about your work, who are you and how would you describe yourself?
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be on your show. I think, first and foremost, I'm a pro-life activist. I'm the communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. We're an educational organization committed to reaching millions of Canadians with the truth about abortion every year. And so last year we had, at our peak, when all of our interns were with us, over 90 people on the team, putting boots on the ground every day across the country. We reached over 7 million Canadians with the truth about abortion. So that's my sort of primary job. But and a corollary to that, um, I write for a wide range of publications on issues related to abortion. So I write a lot about the history of the sexual revolution, how we got here, the pro-life movement. How did we end up going from a Christian culture, both in Canada, the United States, and indeed across the West, to the very anti-Christian culture we live in now? And so that's a subject that I've dealt with in a couple of books, including my most recent book, which is called How We Got Here, A Guide to Our Anti-Christian Culture. And then I end up speaking on that issue a lot in the United States, all across Canada, and in Europe to a certain degree as well. So kind of an activist and a writer. Those are the two main hats that I wear.
That's amazing. And I have gotten to, hear you speak before and share the incredible pro-life knowledge that you've developed. And, the pro-life movement is really kind of centered around a massive emergency, right? Because we're trying to stop the killing of these valuable preborn children. And one of the cool things I've found as I've gotten to know people in the pro-life movement is people have developed such important, unique skill sets because we need a variety of people in order to stop this destruction. And you have this really interesting and amazing part of that in a unique role in the pro-life movement of you have a very heavy like knowledge of history and of apologetics and of reaching people with the pro-life message through your work at Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. So I'm very excited to get to explore all of your knowledge about history. I have some knowledge of history on the sexual revolution, that kind of thing, but I know I'm not naturally like a history buff. So it's really cool to have someone like that on the show today so we can discuss these topics. Because it's like they say, if we don't know where we came from, we're bound to repeat it again. We're going to make the same mistakes and we're going to create the same oppression again and again. And unfortunately, we are at that point in our history. So for those who are listening and they're wondering how you got to this point, Jonathon, what is your pro-life story and why do you care about the unborn personally?
So I got raised in a pro-life Christian home, and so if you'd asked me when I was a teenager if I was pro-life, I would have told you yes. I probably wouldn't have been able to explain very effectively why I was pro-life. It was just sort of one of the views that you get to hold when you grow up in a Christian home. And then when I was in university, first or second year university, one of my professors mentioned abortion, just sort of casually offhand, like it was no big deal. And I thought, I know I don't agree with him, but I don't really know why. So I went up to the university library and I Googled the word abortion and ended up watching an entire abortion video from start to finish. It was a baby being sort of physically pulled apart with metal tools. And that was one of those moments. There's very few moments in your life where you look back and you're like, that's before and after. But that moment really was a before or after moment for me, for sure. Because realizing that this was happening not just in a video, but it was happening here and it was happening now and it was happening in the city that I was going to school at. It was happening in the country that I called home. Radically changed the way that I viewed my country. And so I got involved first with the pro-life club on campus, and then I was invited to attend the Genocide Awareness Project, as it was then called, in Florida, to do campus outreach. And doing campus outreach in front of abortion victim photography, I realized that it's actually possible to change people's minds. I saw people changing their minds about abortion, something that I didn't know was possible. And that really made me realize, well, the thing we have to do here is to do this again and again to more and more people, because people actually can shift their perspective on abortion. I remember the first time somebody changed their mind after a conversation I had with her. I actually almost didn't believe her. Like, really, you changed your mind? Like,
You're
this
like, are you
works?
sure?
Like, yeah, exactly. And so that sort of really escalated my involvement in the pro-life movement. And then instead of heading off to do my master's degree in history, which I was planning to do after I was finished my Bachelor of Arts degree in history, I instead accepted a job offer from the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform to work on the national plan to bring the truth about abortion to millions of Canadians, which we're still doing today.
That's so incredible. And what's so interesting about your story too, Jonathan, is like, your story has abortion victim photography in it, and then you went and used that to help change other people's minds. And if you're okay with that, I'd love to explore that for just a second because there are still a group of people in the pro-life movement who think that abortion victim photography isn't effective or like it's somehow like offensive in a way that's dishonoring to these children. But I think your story is such a powerful example that seeing what this child suffered has motivated you to really help drive revolution to end abortion. It didn't cause you to disrespect the unborn child or something, you know what I mean? Like it caused you to see that they're valuable people too. So, what would you say to pro-lifers listening in who are kind of bought into that mindset that we shouldn't use abortion victim photography?
Because it was really my first introduction to the movement, I'll admit I kind of struggled with understanding the logic behind opposing abortion victim photography when I started off. Because you wouldn't, like I was doing a degree in history, right? You didn't teach about the Rwandan genocide without showing images of what happened during the Rwandan genocide. You didn't show sort of happy pre-genocide families. You showed
Right.
what actually happened to them. When you're getting taught about the Holocaust, they don't just merely show you pictures of smiling pre-war Anne Frank. They show you pictures of the
Right.
death pits of Auschwitz and Sobibor and Bergen-Belsen. And so we understand with relation to any other injustice and any other historical atrocity that in order to fully understand what it is that we're talking about, we need to actually see imagery of the victims. And pro-life activists are, in essence, essentially lawyers for the preborn child in the court of public opinion. And to suggest that we refuse to use the best evidence that we have for what is happening it just strikes me not only as unstrategic, but just sort of a very confusing position to hold. In terms of disrespecting the bodies of preborn children, I always think immediately of your friend and mine, Dr. Monica Miller, who I think is probably in the United States the person who has photographed the most bodies of preborn children. She is one of the greatest advocates for the use of abortion victim photography, which is incidentally a phrase she came up with herself. I remember when she unveiled that phrase at a 2013 summit in Chicago on the use of abortion victim photography, or graphic images as they were called then. And she's the one who retrieved these children from the trash bins and ensured that they were given a good burial. She is the one who distributed these images to various pro-life leaders to spend a week or two or more with one of these photos and then to write a reflection on that child. She says that the victims not only have the right to our defense, they also have a right to be seen because only by being seen can they take their place amongst us as rightful members of the human family who were here for very briefly and then were so brutally taken away. And so we do not disrespect their bodies any more than I think a Jewish group disrespects victims of the Holocaust by a display on the Holocaust any more than the U.S. Holocaust Museum disrespects the victims by showing the evidence of what took place to them, any more than I was actually at the Rwandan Genocide Memorial in Kigali some time ago with my wife. And when you go through there, they have all of these images of what happened, and these images do not respect them. They call out to us for our attention so that we do not make the same mistakes again, or in the case of abortion victim photography, to put a stop to something that is happening every day. So historically speaking, every movement has used photographs of injustice to end that injustice. The picture behind me is actually Granville Sharp, who is a prominent member of the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade with William Wilberforce. They used
Mhm.
imagery. Lewis Hine, the National Child Labor Committee, used imagery. The Civil Rights Movement used imagery. I could give you another 20 examples, but I won't overload your audience with history details. But the idea that we should not use the best evidence of the atrocity of abortion is actually unique to the pro-life movement in a lot of ways. There is no other movement that has a debate about whether or not we should use the best evidence of what is currently happening.
That's an excellent point, Jonathan. And yes, the unborn really do deserve to be seen in their suffering. And I'm glad that at the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform, it's something you guys are doing to really try to move a very apathetic country that's just very broken by abortion to see the truth. And really, the whole world needs to see this atrocity so that we can end it and stop it. So, kind of moving to a different point of our discussion today. You have written many books. You were just telling me about one a moment ago. I have one of your books here with me, The Culture War. So you have written extensively on the history of the sexual revolution, which I'm not sure what background our, listeners may have. Maybe they've heard about the sexual revolution before. Maybe they've never heard of it. So to briefly give it a rundown, the reason we have legal abortion today is in large part because of the sexual revolution. And so understanding the history of the sexual revolution helps us to see how we can help our culture heal and how we can create a future where we protect all preborn lives and where we create or where we're treating sex like it's sacred, which is something our culture has lost. And when we lost that, one thing that has resulted is a lot of unplanned pregnancies, a lot of people becoming parents in situations that they weren't expecting because they didn't have a good, healthy view of human sexuality. And so, if someone was to ask you, Jonathan, and they'd never heard of the sexual revolution before, had no idea how that played a role in abortion, how would you start to explain that to them?
So the only difficulty about questions about the sexual revolution is there's so many different directions that I could take this question. I think I'll start with sort of just a generic agreed upon definition that all historians accept, which is the sexual revolution was a movement between the 1960s and the 1980s, although I would argue, of course, that it's still ongoing, in which all of the traditional moral boundaries were thrown out. And so this involved sex outside of marriage. This involved the mainstreaming of LGBT ideology and everything that that contains. It involved the push for and then legalization of abortion. All of this was enabled by a technological revolution that came in the mid 1960s with the FDA approval of the birth control pill, which of course also functions as an abortifacient. So in past centuries, there had been these moments of sort of sexual revolution, but primarily they were academic because the reality is that when people would start to engage in this behavior, reality would assert itself because it turns out that you can't have, recreational sex with reproductive organs. Babies very do often show up as a result of this. Sex makes babies is something that everybody used to understand, but is now very much sidelined as one of the key facts of how human nature and human biology functions. And so when we see this revolution sweeping the United States, which is where it began, the big riots in places like UC Berkeley, but then rapidly around the world, there was, riots everywhere from Paris to London and around the Western world. It was sort of a great throwing off of the traditional Judeo-Christian values that had defined our civilization up until then. And it really does mark a sort of before and after reality for our culture. And if I could put this in sort of generic terms, I spend 20 pages dealing with this in how we got here, which is actually an update to the book you just showed everybody, The Culture War, because so much has happened since then. Um, as we were once societies that were based on scriptural revelation, which is to say every country in the Western world was based on some Christian tradition, whether that was Catholic or Protestant, and that those moral values informed the population of the country. In the United States in particular, obviously John Adams said that the U.S. Constitution was only written for a moral, virtuous people and was totally ill-equipped to serve any other. And so our democracies, our societies, essentially functioned on a Christian foundation. And between the 1960s and 1980s, we essentially saw that Christian foundation get thrown out, get jackhammered away. And that has transformed our society. And all these like little individual culture wars that we see are actually connected because each individual culture war is what we see when a society is exchanging one set of values for another set of values. So the values rooted fundamentally in scriptural revelation are being replaced by values based in sexual revolution. We're seeing that in press, in Hollywood, in the courts, in the halls of power. And we see this on everything from decisions about transgenderism, like the Bostock decision, to Obergefell, to, of course, 1973's Roe v. Wade case, which, thank God, was overturned in 2022. But all these cases are actually just sort of individual culture wars that make up the much, much larger war that is still going on between these two major forces, the forces of traditional values and the forces of sexual revolution. So that's the very, very short version. If I had to give one other small explanation that might help people, a lot of people will say, well, how obviously the collapse of Christianity is what gave way to the sexual revolution. And that for years was sort of the generally understood reason why the sexual revolution came is, well, first people abandoned Christianity, and because they abandoned the rules of Christianity, they then felt comfortable to embrace behaviors that Christianity forbade. But the actual order of things doesn't go quite like that. There's a magnificent book by Mary Eberstadt called How the West Really Lost God. And in that, she explains that fundamentally society is based on the family. And even the passing on of faith from one generation to another is based on the family. Most people, if you ask them, like, why are you a Christian? They're going to say, well, I was raised in a Christian home. It was my parents who took me to church. It was my parents who first introduced me to the Bible. It was my parents who first introduced me to religious services. And so for most people, that's their story. But what happened was when the sexual revolution occurred, you saw the family begin to break up because the family cannot contain a sexual revolution because families are all about order, sexual order. And so when the family broke apart, the vessel in which faith flourished fell apart as well. And so it was the sexual revolution that triggered the secularization that we are seeing now to this day, because a sexual revolution and a Christian culture cannot coexist. And many of the primary sexual revolutionaries recognized this and actually wrote about it. So Wilhelm Reich, an American, he's the one who coined the term sexual revolution, actually said, we don't have to argue about whether or not God exists. If we can destroy the bonds of family by a sexual revolution, then God will disappear all on his own. And to a large extent, that's what we've seen happen.
That is so true. Wow, that's a really interesting way too of describing like kind of all the series of things that are happening. That if you destroy the family, it's so much easier to break apart these strong moral foundations we have. So that's it's really a tragedy. Are you familiar with Dr. Curie Gress and her book, The End of Woman? Have you read that book before?
So I've watched interviews with her, but I actually haven't read her book. It's on my list.
Okay, so I read that book a little while ago, and it was very interesting because kind of that another movement that's obviously really impacted where we're at with abortion right now is feminism as well. And so she talks about how even like the first wave of feminists, like in the 1700s, some of them were trying to have early forms of abortion, which was not always very effective because, in early forms of abortion, they didn't even know that germs existed yet. So when they tried to would enter women's body cavities, women would usually die as well, not just the baby. But she talked about how in some early feminist thought, there still was this idea conceived even that early that women's biology is by its nature slavery. Like we should believe we're inherently oppressed by being female because men are free and women are slaves. And that the best way for women to be free is to abolish the family. So it kind of had that same kind of language. Do you think there's a pretty strong connection? Does it seem like there's a connection between like feminist ideology and the sexual revolution?
Yeah, feminist ideology is a difficult term to unpack because I would say looking at the first wave feminist movement, it's just a distinctly mixed bag, and so you can kind of make whatever case you want to depending on who you pull out. So of course the Feminists for Life of America would claim, well, you've got people like Alice Paul. You have very specific feminists who are always horrified by the idea of abortion, and they can point to very strong quotes emphasizing that abortion is not only a crime, but that abortion destroys the family, which they wanted to preserve. You can find other people that are engaging in sort of strange occult practices, but at the same time, this was not particularly rare back then. Like people kind of forget historical context sometimes. There was a there was sort of a rage in terms of occult and mystical stuff amongst the American establishment of that period. So it wasn't at all limited to or specific to old guard feminists. So I would say that feminist ideology at its root, in that it defines men and women not in relation to each other and then to the family, but as sort of separate entities with competing rights, I think is fundamentally destructive and dangerous. I think in the context of it, we have to recognize that there were figures who were not attempting to accomplish that, that there were individual old guard feminists that I think were doing something very good, and they were responding to specific injustices. I'm sure you think that women should be allowed to have a credit card and to attend university and to do all of these or to own property, right? There were a lot of things that they were fighting for that obviously needed to be done. And there was a lot of family law that needed to be reformed because essentially women could be kept in abusive marriages because the children were seen as belonging to the husband. So again, it's a mixed bag. And one of the difficulties about researching, even the sexual revolution is we always want to, and this is my temptation, is draw a through line, right? These people said this happened, that's why we're here. But it is a lot more complex than that. And so I think that Gress's fundamental conclusions that feminism as an ideology that pits men and women against each other and therefore against the family was toxic and poisonous is absolutely true. I tend, however, to think that there is a trend right now, especially on the right, of blaming women for everything. And so they really want to blame feminists for having destroyed the culture. Whereas I think the sexual revolution, which Dr. James Dobson once said was the biggest joke men ever played on women, is far more to blame than the feminist revolution was. Although there was clearly synergy between aspects of the movement as run by people like Germaine Greer, Gloria Steinem, and the sexual revolutionaries themselves. But it's also important to realize that that movement split over this. It split very famously at a meeting at the Mayflower Hotel in the 60s. This is described in a book called Subverted by Sue Ellen Browder, which is a very, very good book. And then many of those people split off and ended up instead joining pro-life organizations and fighting for the rights of preborn children. And many of them were very against the more radical aspects of this. But today, I think that the final frontier in the sexual revolution has been sort of the degradation of the culture at a mass scale through the use of pornography. And I'm just very suspicious of people who like to fixate on feminism while ignoring the fact that over 90% of young men are consuming pornography regularly. It's like, well, why don't we deal with that first? Because right now, there's all kinds of young women who will say, oh, I don't want to get married because of X, Y, Z, and everybody targets them. And what I'm hearing from young women after speaking on pornography is that why would you want to get married in a culture when people are consuming the degradation and abuse of women in their spare time? So I'm suspicious of fixating on feminism because our current cultural circumstances, I don't think, have been created primarily by feminism. I think there's other more deeply rooted and more pressing problems to address, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's yeah, that is interesting perspective. I think I kind of have studied at length what like Dr. Gress's like what she said on her perspective. And she kind of actually has an opposite perspective of Sue Ellen Browder, if I'm saying the right her name correctly.
Hmm.
So she doesn't really believe that there was like a division that, but that most feminists like that there was kind of, especially in the first wave, it was showing kind of the early symptoms that we eventually saw later in the culture. And of course, there are going to always be, there's going to be some variety in every movement where some are going to go this way and some are going to go that way, and they're not going to agree on everything. And there are
Well,
certain
if I knew we were going to discuss this, the last time I saw you was in Washington D.C. when some of the POW folks and several other people got arrested, and one of the women who was there was actually at that meeting at the Mayflower Hotel and founded Feminists for Life of America. Has been arrested defending the preborn many times. Has a large and wonderful family and has been doing pro-life work into her old age. So, in terms of sweeping narratives, again, in response to Gress saying there was no good in this movement, no good people, I could have introduced you to one of them in DC
well,
at
I'm
the
sure
very
there are
last
many good
event.
people in it. I don't know if
Mhm.
Gresh says that there's like no good
Mhm.
people in it. I would agree with you. There's so many wonderful pro-life people that would describe themselves as feminists and that have done truly incredible work. I had the honor of interning with POW, and we disagree on many things because I'm a conservative Christian and they are not that. They would describe themselves as feminists, and like I still believe that much of their work is like when it comes down to trying to change the laws to protect the unborn, like I would agree with that. So, there's
If I have to like say what my comment is on the word feminist now particularly, I think that that feminist is now inextricably intertwined with 65 million babies killed by abortion. And that the idea of calling one a pro-life feminist in 2026 or trying to redeem the term feminism as you see people trying to do is I think, misplaced attempt to be edgy and culturally relevant by pro-lifers. If the term ever was useful and if the term ever did mean something other than what it means now, that day is long past. And I don't think there's any point in trying to resurrect an ideology that is now connected to a death count that easily outstrips some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century.
yeah, absolutely. I would definitely agree with you there. So, if you were to look at the sexual revolution, who would you say are the main players that founded this idea? So, obviously, the sexual revolution, like it has its people that came up with the thought processes and then these activists. Who are some of those major people that should be known from history?
So I try to cover some of the biggest figures in my book, How We Got Here. I would say that the main figures are different depending on which strain of the sexual revolution we're talking about, right? Because you do have the feminist movement, and I think for our purposes as pro-lifers, the most insidious figure is probably by far Gloria Steinem, who fought very hard to ensure that abortion on demand was part of the feminist agenda. So I think that she is a figure that has done an enormous amount of damage and has essentially spent her life fighting for the pro-abortion version of feminism. Specifically, she in fact dedicated her memoir to the abortionist who killed her only child.
Mhm.
Then, when it comes to some of the original research that's still used by the sexual revolutionaries today, I mentioned Wilhelm Reich, who coined the term, Dr. Alfred Kinsey. I think some of your listeners and viewers might be familiar with his name, but he did a lot of the junk research that essentially made the case that the vast majority of American people were already living sexually promiscuous lives, and they were just waiting for somebody like him to come along and expose that fact. And so he wasn't making the case that Christianity should be discarded. He was making the case that people had already discarded it and were living it however they pleased. And his research did incalculable damage. Research that we found out decades too late was of course primarily fabricated. Dr. Margaret Mead, who wrote the century's most best-selling anthropological book, would be somebody else I think that really contributed to this. But then we kind of get into different people. If you're looking at gender ideology, if I have to look at the one today, a man who referred to himself as Kinsey's pamphleteer would be Hugh Hefner, who in 1953, after reading the Kinsey reports, founded Playboy magazine, which kind of brought the porn industry out from sort of slimy back alleys and turned it into a glamorous magazine combined with the so-called Playboy philosophy, pardon me. And he was immediately mimicked and copycatted by guys like Larry Flint, by magazines like Hustler and Penthouse and all these other magazines. And pornography became a massive problem almost overnight. And there was a backlash in the 1980s under the Ronald Reagan administration that kind of indicated that pornography as a product could be restricted, could be regulated, potentially even banned. But then, of course, in 1989, the internet was invented and pornography moved online. And then in 2007, the first smartphone came out and it moved from desktop computers onto smartphones. And now virtually everybody who owns a technological device capable of a Wi-Fi connection, which is almost all of them, is carrying a mini porn theater in their pockets. And I think the cultural impact of that has been beyond devastating, and it's a cultural impact that very few people understand the full scale of. It's also one of the first aspects of the sexual revolution that almost thoroughly infiltrated the church, where Christians are also struggling en masse with pornography. And so Kinsey was somebody that was respected and revered by Hugh Hefner, and he called himself Kinsey's pamphleteer and founded the porn industry in 1953. And that, I think, has been the most sort of successful foray of the sexual revolutionaries, in that it was the gay rights movement was very successful, the transgender movement was very successful, although there's been a lot of pushback, especially recently. The pornography movement conquered the culture almost overnight.
And what would you say the connection is between pornography culture and abortion?
So the most obvious connection is they are both aspects of the sexual revolution, but I would say another one of the connections between pornography and abortion is that they're both fundamentally dehumanizing. And there's two ways in which I think pornography interacts directly with the pro-life movement. The first is that one of the reasons it's far easier to recruit females to the pro-life movement than males is because of how many males struggle with pornography. And I always find this very, very interesting. Pornography has a fundamentally castrating effect. If you're a young Christian or a young seeker or a young pro-lifer and you struggle with pornography, that secret struggle is likely to keep you from doing the things that you're actually meant to do, because it does fundamentally castrate you. And the number of young men who I have talked to personally and have told me that their secret struggle with pornography was preventing them from taking the next step into actually standing up for Christian principles in the public square is enormous, because faced with a choice of feeling like a hypocrite and simply opting out of the public square entirely, many of them have just opted to step aside. And I think that's probably not just true for the pro-life movement, it's probably true for almost every form of Christian outreach. On the other side of things, pornography is at the root in our day and age of the conflict between the sexes. And this is what I was getting at earlier when we were talking about feminism. It's absolutely true if you're going back to the 60s and the 70s, and especially in the 80s with sort of sex positive third wave feminism, that feminism essentially set men and women at odds with each other. And then you kind of had aspects of the Me Too movement who were kind of doing the same thing. Although not always. I think there were aspects of the Me Too movement that were a correction, maybe an overcorrection, but certainly a correction to the culture that was being accepted in many places at the time. But now what we have is pornography is rewiring the brains of an entire generation of people to objectify women almost daily on their phones. And the kinds of porn they're looking at almost always feature some form of violence or degradation. Much of it isn't even sexual violence so much as sexualized violence, which is it's just violence being perpetrated against women and girls, and people are arousing themselves to this, and they're wiring their arousal patterns to this. And so I think at the very root of the sort of gender wars right now is pornography. And then when we go back and say, no, the real problem with the gender wars right now is fundamentally feminism, like that's an old diagnosis. I think it's an outdated diagnosis. Now I would say it's pornography. And if you can dehumanize the woman you see, you can very easily dehumanize the child that you can't see. When you believe, because you've been trained to see sex through the lens of pornography, that pornography is fundamentally an act for self-gratification, pregnancy doesn't even show up in your mind. And when a young woman gets pregnant, you almost feel betrayed. This is not what was supposed to happen. And then abortion, that obviously creates the coercive pressure of abortion, which is if abortion is her choice, the baby is also her problem. And abortion is not a choice. In many instances, especially if you talk to high school students, it becomes a cultural expectation. Choice obviously has a role to play here, but it's not the beautiful, free, liberating choice presented by the old guard feminists. It is in fact a culturally coerced expectation, and that expectation is based on a pornified view of sex.
Mm, that's so true. That's so devastating. And I appreciate too how you drew attention to the fact that like that porn has like that sedating effect on men. And I don't think, I mean, as a female, like I don't think I fully even understand like how it pulls men out of the fight. But if you look around at the pro-life movement, yeah, I think people ask constantly, where are the men? Why aren't the men coming? Where, why are all these people not being engaged? But addiction plays a big role. And yeah, it's so devastating how that has just changed our culture in so many ways. And even as you're describing, like how pornography has changed the way that men view women and then dehumanize them, and how also it has kind of caused us not to realize like that connection between sex and pregnancy, and then how that leads into that coercive pressure to have an abortion. Do you believe that like contraception plays a role there too? Because sometimes what contraception seems to do too is it almost creates this mindset of like, sex will never lead to pregnancy unless you really, really, really want it to. Then it will. And I think with that mindset, it does almost prime people for a crisis pregnancy because every form of contraception has a failure rate, every single one besides abstinence. And so I think it seems to me when I look at history that with the advent of the birth control pill, which had a failure rate and still does, people became more in the mindset of having a crisis pregnancy because now this pregnancy is so foreign and this is not supposed to happen. This is a complication. What do you think about that?
No, I think you're right. I'm opposed to the birth control pill fundamentally on ethical grounds, and that it can cause an abortion. It
Hmm.
can potentially function as an abortifacient. I also agree with you that when the birth control pill got mainstreamed, it was the technology that made a false promise. It promised people that the sexual revolution was possible because we now finally had the means to create the category of recreational sex with no risk of pregnancy. When that turned out not to be true, it was, of course, not even a decade after the birth control pill was approved by the FDA that abortion was legalized. And you see this in country after country after country, that where contraceptive use becomes the norm, then abortion inevitably becomes legal because abortionists are basically the mop-up crews to get all the babies that manage to get through. That's basically how the abortion industry functions. It's a fail-safe for the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution is the bloodiest revolution in human history. If you look at the sheer cost of 40 million babies around the world being aborted every single day, the sexual revolution is far bloodier than the French Revolution. It's bloodier than the Russian Revolution, and it's even bloodier than Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. When it comes to contraception writ large, this is obviously in particular a Christian conversation. And so non-Christians, of course, wouldn't see an issue with contraception in particular. And I think that abortion is a justice issue and that contraception is a moral issue. I think there's obviously Christians who disagree. On the other hand, if you're going to look at history, it's I think very revealing to note that Christians were unified on this all the way up until the 1920s, when at the Lambeth Conference, the Church of England first decided that contraception was licit in a very tiny minority of cases. And so for Christians to say that contraception is licit, they have to look at the entirety of the history of the Christian church, from both all of the key Protestant reformers and to the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and explain what we have figured out in the last 100 years that makes us smarter than them? What was it that we discovered that changed our minds? And so I think that the issue of contraception is primarily presented as a Catholic issue. I am a Protestant, and I don't think at all that it's just a Catholic issue. I think that that was the collective Christian position, and I think that that position was abandoned, and I think that the result of abandoning that position has been very, very clear. And so, if we are going to stand in lockstep with our Christian heritage, almost 2,000 years of it, opposition to contraception has always been a fundamental Christian position, not just exclusively a Catholic one. They just hung on to that tradition after many Protestant denominations abandoned it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That is so true. And I'm also Protestant, and I'm with you. I've also spent some time going through the history of it because if you try to talk to the majority of Protestants about moral concerns, even if you just mention only abortifacient contraceptives, which of course, if you're a Christian, that should immediately be off the table. Like you can't just destroy a human life because you don't want to be a parent. That should be off the table. I found that Protestants find it offensive even to discuss that. But it's interesting the way you described it. And I appreciate that you brought that up because most people don't even know about our history. They think, oh, Catholics are really weird, Orthodox people, very weird. We don't know why you have that perspective, but it is historic, and we are the strange ones, and we don't know it. There's a book by Dr. Alan Carlson called Godly Seed, and there are a couple other books kind of like that that kind of goes into the history of like you were talking about the Lambeth conferences and everything. Is there a resource you would recommend for Protestants who don't know the history of contraception and may want to understand better that we've had a veering away from that position that the church had historically?
I don't have a history book on that specifically. Well, I have a couple of giant history books that just kind of look at the Christian church's position through the ages, but nothing that's really accessible. CCBR has produced a book called a Pro-Life Guide to Birth Control that actually walks through every form of birth control that your doctor will pitch you and explains why they have profound ethical issues and can result potentially in an abortion. And so it's a very, very thin little booklet, and it was written just to actually inform Christians about the very question you've discussed. So that's called A Pro-Life Guide to Birth Control and can be purchased at endthekilling.ca. So I would very much, although I'm self-interested here, recommend that resource. I think it's very good.
Yeah, excellent. I'm glad that you guys created a resource for that because there isn't very honest discussion. And I think what people don't understand is that sometimes, in order to make the sexual revolution more comfortable for us, so we don't feel in any way morally troubled about certain aspects of the sexual revolution, is there was a point in history where Planned Parenthood advocates started to get into different parts of like the medical sphere in our country. And there was a point, there's this book called The Global Biopolitics of the IUD. It's very pro-abortion and very pro-contraception. But there's a whole chapter in this book that's like devoted to explaining how a bunch of pro-abortion obstetricians and Planned Parenthood activists, they got together and they decided to redefine what conception means. This does not mean that they're, sperm egg fusion and a brand new embryo. No, no, no. We're going to actually like hit pause on human life existing for 2 weeks, and we're going to pretend this is not a human being until they implant the uterine wall, which embryology fundamentally disagrees with. It still disagrees with it, even though if you read an embryology textbook, they won't bring up this controversy. But this was actually kind of created by the pro-abortion movement. So that's why you'll hear people very strongly argue that, oh, we can use the birth control pill and we can use IUDs, and that's very unharmful to embryos. They say it's not abortifacient. The reason they can argue that, though, is they changed the definition of when human life starts to implantation. And most people have no idea.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I also think it's interesting that people spearheading sort of the anti-IUD, anti-birth control movement are really primarily people concerned about health, because as it turns out, doing that to your body for a very long time is not very healthy. And we're in this very strange moment where people are put on the pill very young for pretty much any condition at this point. And then, maybe when they're in their late 20s and they decide to start having kids, they realize that their fertility has been badly affected by, who would have guessed, pumping all of these hormones into your system. And then, of course, they're pivoting to IVF, and there's over 1 million babies in freezers across the United States. So you see, we've kind of set off this chain reaction of events where we introduce the birth control pill. People begin to take the pill. It's wildly unhealthy for all kinds of reasons that I'm sure you could detail even better than myself. And then this results in a fertility crisis to some degree that's driving the demand for IVF, which is victimizing an enormous number of children. Over 90% of embryos that are created outside the womb don't actually survive, do not actually result in a so-called quote unquote live birth. And so, yeah, we've set off since the sexual revolution We've gained the technological capacity to do things at the very moment that our ethical understanding has profoundly collapsed, and this has been leading to all kinds of really bizarre Frankenstein scenarios.
Yeah, I'm so glad you pointed out those embryos and biofreezers. That really breaks my heart on such a
Yeah.
like a huge level because nobody realize people just do not realize that when people go to have an IVF cycle that they create like 10 embryos and then they grade them and they say, here, only use the one that's grade A. And then once that happens, then we get into this other form of abortion, called selective reduction. We're like, no, 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 don't have twins. We need to kill one of the twins because obviously it'll be healthier if we kill one, which there's not even data proving that you're going to be having a better pregnancy that way anyway. And then we have all these precious embryos that never even given an opportunity to even try to survive a pregnancy. So yeah, those embryos deserve our advocacy as well. And it's just so devastating. One question I want to ask you, Jonathan, is as pro-life advocates, they're considering what you're sharing about the sexual revolution. They may be in college, they may be, working professionals, and they're kind of looking around at their peers. Why do you think it is that young people, or even just people in general in our culture, why are we so persuaded by the sexual revolution? Why do these ideologies work for so many people without them questioning them?
That's a question with a number of answers. I would say that the first one, to beat the hobby horse that I take every opportunity to discuss, I think it is the fact that pornography has programmed people's brains to such a large extent. So there is that. If you're consuming pornography, you're rewiring your brain in very fundamental ways. So that's the first one. The second one is that very few people are aware of any of the history that you and I have just touched on over the past 45 minutes. So most of this history is not well known. And instead, what we get at university, at college, and even to a degree from history textbooks and social studies textbooks is this very different view of history writ large, where key figures are left out. If they're mentioned, we don't get to find out much about them. So Alfred Kinsey was mentioned to me in my first year university history courses on American history, and basically presented as the man who exposed the truth about sex in the United States, and revealed that we didn't need a sexual revolution because it had already occurred. We just needed this academic to come along and break the conspiracy of silence that was enveloping Western culture. And so the story that we are being told is not the real story. And I think that one of the reasons it's so important for people to understand the history of the sexual revolution is because it's so empowering actually to realize that history is not, in fact, on their side as they like to claim, and that a real understanding of history clears up so many misconceptions that we just end up internalizing from high school all the way through university, and that so many of the things that took place were actually very nefarious, that the people that were perpetrating them had a specific plan to do so. They wrote those plans down. Their books are easily accessible. You can still get the Kinsey reports out of the library and see him documenting child abuse in the Kinsey reports. That's still all out there, but we don't really read that stuff very often. And so a knowledge of the sexual revolution, I think, helps people to understand that the story of the West that we have been told is not the real story. The story that we have been told by the politicians, the story we have been told by Hollywood, the story that we have been taught in university is not the real story. And to fill that story out helps us place ourselves in the real story and understand that becoming part of a backlash to this revolution is not only possible, but I think is one of the most exciting things a young person can do with their life. Imagine getting the opportunity to fight for goodness, for truth, and for beauty, and to actually see lives saved. Could there be anything more exhilarating than the opportunity to do that? Not every generation gets that. And I think that our generation has that opportunity.
That's so true. I hope people will take your advice and hear that it's time to stand up for the unborn and to be courageous and defensive people that are being destroyed because of this ideology. That's so true. So, Jonathan, what's the path now? So we have this horrible sexual revolution that's destroyed our culture. What is the path to ending the killing? And what's the path to helping people heal from the sexual revolution so that we can move forward and heal our culture so that abortion is ended and sex is sacred and the family is not decimated like this?
When it comes to the sexual revolution, I think the most important thing to do is to ensure that you yourself are purging elements of the sexual revolution from your life. So if you struggle with pornography, you need to commit to quitting pornography. You need to talk to somebody. You need to either get rid of the devices that are a temptation or to install software like Covenant Eyes and getting an accountability partner, reaching out for help. There's a lot of people who talk about saving the family, but you can't save the family in the abstract. This literally does start at home. And so there's a lot of people who think, well, how can I end pornography in the culture? Well, you can't. But what you can do actually is talk to your friends, find out which ones struggle with pornography, offer to help them, set up a group, whether you're male or female, with other people who struggle so that you guys can have these conversations and help each other through that. I think that's really, really essential to do because there are people that you can reach that nobody else can reach. There are people who talk to you about things they don't talk to anybody else about. And so you can start with that, right? There's an old joke that says everybody wants to save the world and nobody wants to pick up the trash on their street. When it comes to the sexual revolution, we need to start with ourselves and then move outwards. And so I think that we need to do that for starters. Second of all, I would say do get educated on the history of the sexual revolution because until you understand how our culture got to where it is, you cannot really understand how to help the culture move forward. I think bad history makes for bad strategy. And if you're reading the wrong story, then you can't actually find out where you are in that story and you will make the wrong decisions. And I think that this has been a perennial problem where people's understanding of history, if it's incorrect, will lead to them making the wrong strategic decisions, even about which kind of pro-life work that they do. Finally, I would say find a pro-life group that is focused on changing hearts and minds. And I don't say this to be negative about any kind of pro-life group. There are many different arms of the pro-life movement. They're all doing something else. But one of the reasons that I would advise young people to get involved with a group where you actually see pro-choice people become pro-life, where you actually get to encounter babies being saved from abortion, is because getting involved in the backlash against the sexual revolution, getting involved in the culture war, to use the colloquial term, can really grind you down. And it can really be depressing. It can really be disappointing. Coming face to face with the darkest elements of our culture can take a lot of strength and can be very grim for people. But one of the reasons, like people often ask me why I stay so optimistic, and it's because at our organization, we see people change their minds every day. And so I can only do what I can do. We can only do together what we can do together. But at the same time, we're reaching more people every day. Our organization grows year over year with young people who are passionate about saving lives. And at least when I go to bed at night, I can comfort myself with the fact that our country is a little bit less awful than it was when I woke up in the morning, which is the best any of us can hope for. And so the kind of pro-life outreach where you actually see people change their minds, where you can see real movement, where you can say, I did that. That was my contribution today. There's one less pro-choice person in the United States. There's one less abortion today in America. Those are things that I think really give you the constant encouragement that it takes to survive long term in a movement that desperately needs every pair of hands and every pair of feet that we can get.
Hmm, that's so true. Yeah, and it can be very hard to be like for people to know that there are so many ways to be involved in the pro-life movement, but I do love seeing the work that Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform does, and it's so cool that people actually do change their minds. One of the things I really love about your organization, Jonathan, is that you guys are very compassionate. You know, when you meet people who are impacted by the sexual revolution, they can be very hostile sometimes. And when I say impacted by the sexual revolution, I often mean women who are post-abortive. You know, they've aside from the unborn child, they're some of the most damaged people from the sexual revolution. When you have your own child dismembered inside your own body, like that's just such a traumatic and awful thing to go through. And one of your, I believe it's the founder, is Stephanie the founder, Stephanie Gray Connors, is she the founder of your organization? I guess I don't know.
Stephanie Gray and Jojo Ruba, yes, they're the two
Okay, they're the
co-founders.
founders. So Stephanie has this book, and she, I think, is it Love Unleashes Life or is it a different one where she talks about heart apologetics, basically, right? Where like you guys spend a lot of time really trying to engage with people in a way that shows them compassion and care. And I think, you know, maybe the trendy word in our culture today is validation. Like you find something to validate in their story and say like, are you okay now? Like, just showing very real compassion. And so, really, like this movement of seeking to end abortion is also a movement of bringing so much healing to people who've been hurting and who've been just really destroyed. Like they're barely hanging on, you know, after the ways they've been hurt through pornography, through abortion, and just broken families. And so, thank you for the work you do because it makes a big difference. And Lord willing, as we work towards the day that hopefully, alas, abortion will be banned around the globe, and finally that children will be protected again, we're going to remember groups like the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform, where so many people were too discouraged to do something, right? Because in your country there are zero laws preventing abortion in any way, which is so discouraging. They don't even stop sex selective abortion. Like any extreme crazy reason you want to have an abortion, it doesn't matter, even if it's at 40 weeks when you're in Canada. And thank God for people like you and your organization who haven't given up under those circumstances. And you say, like, well, we're going to start paving the road for a world free from abortion. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And of course, you're one of the people doing the work as well. And so one of the things I find so encouraging is that at the end of the day, there is so much that we can do. And when you go to the March for Life, the March for Life for me isn't pro-life activism. It's just a chance to see hundreds of thousands of people who are committed to the same thing in one place. So the March for Life shouldn't be the only pro-life thing you do. It should be the thing that you go to get encouragement for all the other stuff that you do. But Joe Scheidler, to kind of close off when you say like what should we do, I'll go back to Joe Scheidler, the great Joe Scheidler. If you don't know him, as the founder of the Pro Life Action League, his nickname was the Godfather of direct pro life action. And his fundamental advice at the end of the day was do something pro life every day.
Mm.
It doesn't have to be big. You don't have to get arrested. You don't have to set up a massive campus display, but do something pro life every single day. And I think that's good advice. If people want to start small, do something pro-life every day, and you'll be amazed at what kind of difference you can make.
That is so true. And I think it's so encouraging too to be a Christian and to have a relationship with God who's in control of everything because we're each so small, right? We're just like, sometimes it feels like a drop in the ocean when you're trying to make a difference, but we can literally take our needs and our requests to God. Like we can go right before the throne of God and ask God to bring a global end to abortion. He's that kind of father where he's always listening to us, he always cares and he cares more about the unborn than we do. So if you're trying, even as you're listening to this podcast, like to think of your pro-life action today, start by praying. And today we're praying for a total global end to abortion. That's not too hard for God. So we're going to ask, we're going to start making moves even right now while we're just listening in. And so thank you so much, Jonathon. I really appreciate your time and thanks for sharing your extensive knowledge with us. How can people find you? They just listen to that. Wow, I need to hear more from Jonathon. Where can they find that?
If you go to thebridgehead.ca, that's where my writing is, where my books are, and then I have the Bridgehead podcast on YouTube, same name.
Okay,
And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
of course. Thank you for coming to join us today.